Hey guys, it's Jake here from the Honest Gadget, and this is the YUNZII B75 Pro Max mechanical keyboard. This was sent to me by YUNZII, however all opinions are my own. The retail of this keyboard is just under $100, and if it's on sale you can usually get it in the $70 to $85 range on the website itself or on other retailers like Amazon. That puts it in the upper budget range for a mechanical keyboard, so I'm expecting to get a lot more than a basic keyboard, but not quite as much as a premium keyboard. I'm going to cover the full experience here, from the unboxing to the build and design, to the screen, typing feel, RGB, software and battery life. I'm also going to mention what I really liked and what I didn't like as well, so you can decide if this is actually worth buying. Okay, I'm just going to do a quick unboxing here. This is the B75 Pro Max, and on the bottom of the box here it says water and beverages can't be poured into the keyboard, which is always good to know. Thanks for that warning, YUNZII. The YUNZII keyboards I've reviewed have all been packaged in an outer sleeve. So now we got the actual box itself, which houses the keyboard. You can see here it's packaged quite well, the keyboard. It's in between two foam pieces, so I don't think you're going to have any delivery issues with this one. You get a feature card, which tells you what the keyboard comes with. Then you get a manual which tells you how to use the keyboard, plus all the hotkeys to control things like lighting and functions. There's also an accessory box which has a few components. You get a keycap puller to pull out switches and keycaps. There's also a USB-C cable for wired use and charging. The cable's not bad, it's just a simple rubber cable, but it will do the job just fine. Then you get extra keycaps, which is always good. Most of these are function keycaps, so you can put them in and map new functions to your keycaps depending on what functions are most useful to you. Then you get two spare switches. And then there's the keyboard itself, which comes with a plastic dust cover. It's basically a piece of plastic which you can put on top of your keyboard when you're not using it so it doesn't collect dust and debris. There's also a 2.4 GHz wireless dongle. Some more expensive YUNZII models, like the one I reviewed before, the X98, have this behind a magnetic back panel, but with this model it's stored in the back panel next to the connection switches. The only issue I had was that I just wish this dongle stuck out a little more, because honestly it's a bit hard to pull out. Right next to that dongle storage are the switches for wireless, Bluetooth and wired mode, along with the USB-C port. When it comes to the YUNZII B75 Pro Max, it looks like they went for this vintage look, which I'm in love with. And I chose the beige color, which actually isn't completely beige. As you can see here, some of the keys are kind of a beige color or a white pastel color. The others are light blue and some of them are gray. For me, they really blend well together, and I think it gives the whole board this quite retro look and also playful at the same time. But it's not just the colors that give it the vintage look, it's pretty much the whole build. You see the case has this classic edge bevel design around the sides, just like some old keyboards from the 80s and 90s. You can see here the body rises slightly towards the back, and there are also edges around parts of the keys, which adds even more to that retro look. On top of this, you also get that small TFT screen on the top right, kind of gives you some modern features for an otherwise classic looking keyboard. I wouldn't call it minimalist, but I do think it looks clean. There isn't any loud branding, and the beige colorway gives it a softer look than a typical gamer keyboard. As you can see, it's also 75% layout, so you're not getting a numpad, but you still keep the function row, arrow keys, and most of the important navigation keys. For me, 75% is one of the best layouts for everyday use. It's more compact than a full-size keyboard, so it takes up less room on your desk, but it doesn't feel too stripped back either. So if you have a smaller desk setup, or you just like the cleaner look of a compact keyboard, this layout makes a lot of sense. Alright, so I'll just flip this over. On the bottom here you can see there are 5 rubber feet plus 2 stage kickstand feet if you want to use this at an angle. I always like seeing 2 height options because some keyboards only give you 1 angle or no adjustable angle at all, and that can be annoying if the default typing height doesn't work for you. On my desk, this feels really planted. There's no sliding around, you have to actually push it quite hard for it to move, and it has a decent amount of weight to it as well. It weighs around 993 grams or about 2.19 pounds, which puts it somewhere in the middle for mechanical keyboards. It's not insanely heavy, but it also doesn't feel cheap or hollow. To be fair, that is kind of heavy for a plastic build keyboard, which this is. This is not made from an aluminium chassis, but I think a lot of that weight comes from the internals. This uses a gasket style structure with several layers inside, including things like the PCB foam, silicon dampening, the gasket layer, and the plate. Some people might see the plastic case as a negative, but honestly, I don't really mind it. It feels sturdy, it's still weighty, and it adds to the retro but playful aesthetic. One of the main features of the B75 Pro Max is the little screen on the top right corner. By default, the screen shows useful information like the date, time, battery life, and whether you're using a Mac or Windows layout. It also shows things like caps lock, WinLock, and your current connection, whether that's wired, Bluetooth, or 2.4 GHz. WinLock is especially handy for gaming. The screen is not just there to display information, you can also customize it with your own image or GIF. Keyboard already comes with a default image and GIF installed, but you can change them through YUNZII's screen software, which I'll talk about later. There's also physical LED indicators below the screen, and they basically show the same information as the screen itself. Obviously they're useful if your screen is just showing an image, but aesthetically I'm not in love with them. I don't feel they really need to be there, and to be honest, even nowadays I don't really even need a caps indicator because Windows itself has a pop-up that shows you if the caps key is locked or unlocked. You can't really customize these indicator lights either, and you can't fully turn them off from what I could find. They also have a bit of light bleed, and you can see some of that around nearby keycaps, which can interrupt the RGB flow of the keyboard. This is just a minor gripe, and I can see lots of people not agreeing with me here, but yeah, I think removing these lights in favor of a more cohesive design could be a good move in future designs. As you can see next to the screen here, you also get a volume knob. By default, you can turn it to adjust volume and press it down to mute or unmute. You can also customize it in the software to do other functions, which is always nice. It works, and I always like having a volume knob on a keyboard, but this is definitely not my favorite knob. It isn't very grippy, and pressing it down takes a bit more force than I'd like. For me, it feels like the cheapest part of this keyboard. From what I read, it is also possible for you to remove the knob, so you can always replace it in the future if you want something more aesthetic. Now, before I get into the overall typing feel and sound, I want to elaborate a bit on the keycaps and switches because they obviously have a lot to do with the typing experience you're going to get. The keycaps are PBT cherry profile keycaps, and they're also double shot. So I'm just going to go through a little deep dive here into what that means. PBT is a tougher type of plastic compared to cheaper ABS keycaps you'll find in a lot of budget keyboards. PBT is more resistant to shine, so over time the keycaps are less likely to go glossy or slippery from finger oils. They usually keep that slightly textured feel for longer as well. You can see that the legends are a bit more muted and less bright than what you might get on some ABS or shine through keycaps, but that's normal for this kind of keycap. Personally, I like it. It makes the keyboard look more old school, which suits the overall design. And because these are double shot, the legends aren't just printed on top. The letters are made from a separate piece of plastic that is sort of shot through or molded into the keycap shell and stem, hence the name double shot. Basically, the legends will barely fade or rub off like basic printed keycaps. And the last ingredient is the cherry profile, which is actually a pretty common profile these days. It's a little lower than standard OEM keycaps, and it has that familiar sculpted shape that slightly hugs your fingertips to make a more enjoyable typing and gaming experience. Just keep in mind these caps are not shine through, so even though the RGB is bright, the legends themselves don't light up. Now, if I remove the keycaps, underneath you'll see the switches. I chose the YUNZII Milk V2 linear switches. There are also two other switches you can choose from, straight from the website, to customize the feel and sound of your board. These switches are pre-lubed and they're also hot swappable, so you can replace them with most 3-pin or 5-pin MX style mechanical switches, even if they're not from YUNZII, so you're getting plenty of customization here. The Milk V2 switches feel light, smooth, and easy to press. They don't have a tactile bump or click, so the keystroke is very direct. For gaming, I think they work well because they're light and easy to spam. For typing, they also feel smooth, but because they're on the lighter side, you might make a few more mistakes if you're used to using heavier switches. The stabilizers are also pre-lubed and plate mounted. Plate mounted means the stabilizers are attached to the plate instead of directly to the PCB. The benefit is they're easier to pop out, adjust, or re-lube. The downside is that they can sometimes be a bit less stable and more prone to wobble or rattle compared to PCB mounted stabilizers. But in my time with the YUNZII B75 Pro Max, I haven't had any stabilizer issues. But maybe later on, after some use, I might encounter some wobble as the stabilizers get more worn out. Okay, so when we put the build, the keycaps, and the stabilizers and switches all together, that creates a certain sound and feel for using this keyboard. And to be honest, I really enjoy typing on it and gaming as well. YUNZII describes the Milk V2 switches as having a low sound level, but I wouldn't really describe it that way. To me, it's more of a clacky, crispy, airy, thocky sound with a medium sound level. It's not super deep, it's not ultra muted, but it also doesn't sound thin or cheap. The gasket structure and internal dampening definitely play their part here to make it more of a premium feel and sound rather than something cheap. The board has a slightly softened bottom out. I also would describe this as middle of the road. It's not super soft, but not firm and hard either. So overall, I'd say the typing feel is one of the best parts of this keyboard. Here's what it sounds like so you can judge it for yourself. As you would have noticed, due to the space underneath the keycaps, some sound different from others, most notably the spacebar and other larger keys. This is expected, and I've never used a keyboard with the same sound across all keys anyway. Alright, let's take a look at the RGB, which is something that YUNZII is famous for. And in typical YUNZII fashion, it's simply fantastic. The lights can get exceptionally bright, brighter than most RGB keyboards I've used, and you can get a lot of effects to play around with. All of the effects transition really smoothly and there's no jankiness. The RGB uses south-facing LEDs, and you can customize the lighting through the software or keyboard shortcuts. You can change things like brightness, speed, effect, and color. Since the keycaps are not shine through, the RGB is more about underglow and lighting between the keys rather than lining up the legends. But it still looks really nice, especially if you like brighter RGB, because this thing can get really bright. Of course, you can tone it down if you don't want it to be too intense. Now, the software side is a bit trickier. The keyboard uses QMK with VIA support, which is great if you want deeper customization, but getting it to work is a more fiddly than I like. You need to go to YUNZII's software page, find the B75 Pro Max, download the JSON file, connect the keyboard in wired mode, open VIA link, go to the design tab, and then upload the JSON file. Once it's working, it can be pretty powerful. You can remap keys, adjust layers, set media controls, and create macros. You also do get more granular controls for the lighting with a hex color map and sliders for brightness and speed. To be honest, setting this up isn't exactly beginner friendly. It's not as polished as some dedicated software, and I had a kind of hard time using it. I accidentally remapped some of the keys because as you actually map them, they're saved on the fly. There's no actual save button here, so I had to redo them again. I'd love to see YUNZII eventually have one clean dedicated software hub for all of their keyboards. Some YUNZII boards have dedicated software, some use VIA, and it can feel a bit inconsistent. That said, I think most people probably won't care too much. A lot of people will probably just want to customize the lighting, which can be done with hotkeys anyway. There's also a second part of the software, which is customizing the TFT screen, which is pretty straightforward compared to using QMK and VIA. You can go to yunzii-game.com, connect the keyboard in wide mode, and upload an image or GIF. You can also adjust settings like the chroma, saturation, and grayscale. There's also an equipment tab where you can sync the time, clear images or GIFs, and switch between display modes. The interface does look a bit outdated and isn't the most polished or fluid experience, but it works. And realistically, most people will probably upload one image or GIF, set it once, and then leave it alone for a while. You can also switch between the default screen, image, and GIF using the hotkeys listed in the manual. Again, as I said before, I do hope YUNZII eventually combines all of these features into a one cleaner software hub, because right now VIA works and the TFT tool works, but having to use two separate tools makes the whole setup feel less seamless than it should, and I'd be happy to pay a slight premium to just get one complete user-friendly software tool. Alright, so this keyboard uses an 8000 mAh battery, which is pretty big for a wireless mechanical keyboard. Of course, the battery life itself depends heavily on how you use it. If you turn off the RGB in the screen, YUNZII claims it can last up to 30 days, but if you use bright RGB and you switch on the TFT screen, especially with an animated GIF, battery life drops much faster. YUNZII rates it at around 48 hours with these features on, so the screen and lighting clearly make a huge difference. For me, that doesn't really bother me because I use my keyboard in wide mode most of the time, but if you're planning to use it wirelessly all the time, just know that the battery will last much longer with the RGB and display turned off. So here are the things I like about the YUNZII B75 Pro Max. First, I really like the overall design. The beige colorway, the retro shape, and the TFT screen give it a nice vintage tech look. The typing experience is also excellent for the price. The Milk V2 switches are smooth and light, the board sounds good, and the gasket structure gives it a nicer, thocky feel than a basic budget keyboard. The RGB is also fantastic, you get a lot of settings to play with. It can get very bright, but you can also adjust it if you want something more subtle. I also like the 75 layout. It's compact without feeling too limited, and it gives you more desk space while still keeping useful keys. The plastic build also doesn't bother me. It feels sturdy, it has some weight, and I don't think it feels cheap at all. Lastly, I like that this board is hot swappable with lots of other MX style switches, which is a big plus since not every mechanical keyboard gives you this kind of flexibility. Now for the things I don't like. The first one is the status LED area. I understand why those lights exist, especially when the screen is being used for a custom image or GIF, but visually, I think they interrupt the overall aesthetic of the keyboard. The light bleed also doesn't look too good, especially when you have RGB on. The knob is also a bit disappointing. It works, but it's not very grippy, and when you press it down, it feels a little bit too stiff and feels like it gets a bit smushy on the board as well. The dongle slot is another small annoyance. It sits too deep in the keyboard, so it can be hard to remove. And finally, the software experience could be better. VIA support is powerful, but it has a learning curve and can be tricky to use, and the screen software does work but feels pretty outdated and kind of buggy. None of these are deal breakers for me, but I figured that you should know these things before you decide to buy this keyboard. It's also worth comparing this to a couple of other YUNZII keyboards. For around $20 more, you can get something like the YUNZII AL80, which has a full CNC aluminium body and Gateron Zero switches, which are a higher quality switch compared to the switches you get with the B75 Pro Max. Of course, the feel and sound is up to your preference, but objectively speaking, the Gateron Zero switches are the better built switch. There's also the YUNZII X98 transparent keyboard that I reviewed in a previous video, and it's also around $20 more, but offers a 96% layout with transparent keycaps, so you can really get the full effect of the RGB if that's what you are looking for. Then there's the older YUNZII B75 Pro, which is usually about $5 cheaper, but compared to the B75 Pro Max, it doesn't have the TFT screen, the battery is smaller as well at 4000 milliamps, and it uses standard driver support instead of QMK and VIA. So I think the $5 extra for the B75 Pro Max is well worth it. All in all, I do like the YUNZII B75 Pro Max, and I think it's worth its asking price. I wouldn't call it insane value, but I would call it good value. It's definitely worth considering if you like the vintage look and want a fun TFT screen. The typing feel is great too, so I think that's a big positive here. It does have some drawbacks, but not enough for me not to recommend it. So that's my review of the YUNZII B75 Pro Max. What do you guys think? Would you purchase this keyboard? Are there other mechanical keyboards out there that you would recommend over this one? Drop any questions or thoughts in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.